Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio. My name is Eirik, welcome to my new viewers and welcome back to the old ones. I hope there are some of you here. First of all, wee announcement. I want to make a video answering questions soon, but to have a video I need some questions to answer. This is where you come in. Please ask any questions you might have in the comments below so that I'll have a video. Questions can be about anything, how I sculpt materials, how I make videos, whatever you're curious about, ask below in the comments and I will try and do my best to answer. I hope to make a Q&A video maybe 3 or 4 times a year going forward, but with no questions there'll be no video, so ask away below please. On screen right now you're watching me model the surface and make subtle adjustments. There are an important distinction to make between modeling and cleaning up the surface. It might look or appear as if I'm making the surface nicer, but this is just a byproduct of the modeling stage. The goal with the modeling stage is to accurately, or in a way that fits the sculpture at least, not always accurately, represent the transition in between the forms as best as possible. Sometimes represent them as accurately as possible. There's also the volumetric nature of the forms themselves, which I attempt to deal with at this stage, though I find that almost always I need more volume and I'm never able to realize it, I guess, until the end, where I think it's easier to spot at the end perhaps, and I kind of bake a bit of adding volume into the cleaning up the surface stage. Of course, all of these stages are fluid and I drift between many of them at the same time. Included in the modeling stage, there are redrawing of shapes into more accurate or more interesting shapes. Without the canvas of the transition, it was hard to get the accuracy I'm after in the drawing. But now, with the transitions nearly at their final resting place, it can more easily be done. So the steps are fluid, and I don't need to do this everywhere, which is a good thing, only in a few places, only in the spots I deem necessary. If I treated this step by only pulling clay in between the forms without worrying about the volume of forms or the shapes of the forms themselves, I think the sculpture would end up probably way too flat, meaning not enough volume, and it would look generalized, meaning the shape would be slightly too simple, and the solutions would be slightly too easy. The shapes I established in the beginning are by necessity a little generalized, so now the time has come to steer in a different direction. If my entire sculpture was made in colored clay, and in this video I added clay in a different color, you would really easily see how much of the sculpture gets covered. I don't think I leave a centimeter or inch of the sculpture untouched at this step. It's all part of adding volume to the figure, making sure it occupies space well, considering it's the only thing we have to work with as sculptors. Nothing I think is worse than a flat sculpture. Perhaps this way of sculpting and all the technical jargon I'm always talking about seems mechanical or rigid, and I think you would be right. I thought the same way when I started studying at the Florence Academy of Art, but within this method lies the secrets to infinite freedom in sculpture. The only thing this method limits is how frustrated I really feel when I sculpt. You can never completely get rid of that, of course, the feeling of frustration that is, but I find that the more comfortable I get with this method, the easier it becomes. Things I've done more of, like bodies, rarely frustrates me at this point anymore. Mostly the hands and the head, which are difficult and considered the hardest parts anyway, that get to me. So perhaps I need to do some more portraits and some hand studies to get less frustrated by them. If you pay close attention, I haven't lost my center line in the body even this late in the process. And it'll stay until the bitter end probably. It's extremely useful here at this step also because it's easy to model the forms into asymmetry, ruining the structure that we've spent so much time and effort setting up. It seems almost silly in a way, like too simple to be true, but a center line makes every symmetrical mistake so much more obvious. It's kind of like an anchor, or a mother and a father you can turn to when there are uncertainties and important questions arise. It's especially useful as I'm still blocking in the portrait. This, I think, is a good time to mention my Patreon page. If you are interested in learning sculpture from me personally and get feedback on your work either on email or via video chat, my Patreon is the place for you. You'll get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armature, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So, check it out. There's a link in the description below. An unspoken yet important part of the portrait is the skull, or the head, meaning not the face. So essentially, I'm trying to separate between the face and the head here. The face and the head need to be aligned to the same center line, which doesn't always happen. And if we don't do it, we end up with a portrait of someone that looks like they've been hit in the head by a car. Nothing is worse than a well-sculpted face on the side of a well-sculpted skull. Or, at least slightly on the side. Both things are bad. The face and the head need to belong to the same center line. And just like in the body, the front and the back must align. In this case, it's even more vital because he's bald. He has no hair, and so a crooked skull would be really obvious. Now you might have noticed that sometimes my model is in the background here, and he's not bald. He does have hair, very dark hair, so I can't really see the skull underneath all that hair. I did try to convince him to shave his head, but he didn't fall for it. So I'll need to not only use my center line to ensure the head and the face are heading or facing in the same direction, I need to use the center line to create solid structure and symmetrical forms in the head, the forms of the skull. The head is obviously not a ball, and in keeping with the rest of the figure, I aim to squeeze as much anatomy as I can out of the skull. Luckily, I've sculpted several skulls before, so I'm somewhat familiar with the anatomy here. Familiar enough so that I can make it up, make educated guesses, and use my centerline to ensure the structure of the skull is working well. A little trick you probably see me do every now and then, that you can use to make sure your centerline works well from the front and from the back, is to get up on a stool and look down on the head. This works really well and will help you see clearly if the center line is working well on the front and the back at the same time or not. One thing I've come to enjoy with holding off on parts like the head and the arms is that when one part of the sculpture is at one stage, other parts of the sculpture are at a different stage. Which means there are opportunities to take a break from modeling, for example, and get back to blocking things in again, moving large amounts of clay and seeing large leaps in progress happen fast, which is really encouraging and always makes me feel really good and accomplished, like I actually did something and something actually happened during the 3 hours of work I just put in. Of course, that is not the real reason I hold off on them. The real reason is that neither the arms nor the head is structurally important to ensure the figure remains standing and balanced, though they do play a role, which I've anticipated, of course. So I can hold off on them until more important elements that do more to support the figure's balance and gesture is well established. I used to find this difficult and really infuriating. How can you judge anything without a head on there is kind of how I felt a lot when I was studying. So I might have been a difficult student. But no one thus far has said so, but I have a feeling that I was a little bit tricky to convince. You get used to it, however, and now I find it extremely refreshing to be able to shift gears and do something else at a different tempo from time to time. I think one thing you'll perhaps notice now that I mention it is that if you check the size of the head in the beginning and then the size of the head again at the end of the video, you'll see that it seems to have grown quite a bit. There are several decent, or some might even say good, reasons for this. One of the reasons is of course that I missed the mark on the size of the skull just a bit. Not by a lot, but it needed to grow just a smidge, and so I made that happen. Another reason is that it's just part of the process. It's all part of the process, man. I build the head out very slowly, attempting to solve all the issues that arise while developing a head underways. One of the big pitfalls I think with this method is one of misunderstanding, where you build the portrait too narrow and spend too much time in the narrow state before you begin developing widths. If everything is well developed, but very narrow, and then large amounts of widths are added, it is very likely that you will lose a lot of what you developed and have to develop it again, which is more work and is frustrating and difficult. Imagine that you go to the supermarket to buy groceries, and you have limited funds because you're an artist, and you pay no attention and dump a bunch of groceries into your cart and go to the register without knowing how much money the groceries in your cart will cost. You get to the counter, the lady behind the register scans all your groceries, and you realize you don't have enough money. Now, the lady at the register must return some of your groceries, but which ones? You have to choose. That's difficult. You have to figure that out, bring them back, bring the ones that you want to return back to the shelves they belong to, and there is an angry mob of people behind you waiting to pay for their groceries. So the entire thing is a stressful mess, and the situation is less than ideal. The other option is to plan ahead. Check the prices of all the groceries you put into your cart, paid at the register, and go home. A lot smoother and less stressful experience. I know, that's a crazy proposition, but if you plan ahead and pay attention underways, you won't get the cruel wake-up call at the end of the line. And sculpting portraits is the same way, kind of. Better to go slowly about it, adjust while growing the head towards its final dimension, than realize once you're at the final dimension that you've made several critical errors. Also, you want to keep in mind that the camera is slightly offset from where I observe the model and the sculpture. So while the portrait seemed to be to scale from my vantage point perhaps, and doesn't grow much, which is the profile for most of this video and sometimes for the front, it will look a little bit too small from your vantage point, and it'll also look like I add clay, which makes the portrait grow. I add clay from the profile because it's where I develop pretty much every aspect of my portraits, with the exception of that last little final bits. If I pay attention while building out widths from the profile and keep track, I can in fact build most of the widths I need from the profile, keeping everything in relationship with each other, which I keep track of from the front, and I'll only have to add minimal widths from the front later. If all goes well, every issue should be solved by the time I add the final few millimeters of widths, and the addition of the final widths won't mess up everything I worked on from the profile. I've spoken a lot about the merits of this technique in these videos up to now, and I would love for you, the viewer, to ask some questions that I can answer in a Q&A video. Do you see any holes in the method applied here? Is there something that doesn't make any sense? I'm constantly trying to observe and see in students and the people I talk to about this method with, what are the things people don't get? What is not intuitive about this method, and what doesn't really make sense? What doesn't click? So I'm genuinely interested, and it helps me to think through what I'm doing and see it in a different light. So please ask some questions below. So speaking of the Q&A video, I had people ask me questions on Instagram to use in the video as well, and one of the questions asked was, why is he bald? And that question came from Jay Cormican. I'm sorry if I messed that name up, but I'll link his Instagram below in the description. And I figured that since we're in the middle of talking about sculpting bald heads right now, or heads in general, I might as well answer it right here instead of in the Q&A video. So, why is he bald? The sculpture is about rebirth or change in one's life, which is propagated by asking a question, which is correlated to prayer, and by formulating a question, being able to finally see the true answer and act accordingly. So when we are born, as babies, most of us are born, without hair, or at least not with a lot of hair. So you can kind of think of this figure as a newborn person in that sense. Not only will he be missing his hair, but he'll also be missing his eyebrows. And there's a funny reason for that. I was 9 or 10 when The Matrix came out, and it was a big part of my early teens. I love that film, I still love it. And if I remember correctly, Neo is both bald and has no eyebrows when he is awakened into the real world. So the idea for no eyebrows kind of came from there, which is perhaps a bit silly, but I do love pulling from popular culture and leaving subtle hints as to my obsessions and inspirations. It's a mental rebirth, of course, not a physical one. When new ideas are formed, old ones have to die. When new ways of being are discovered, old habits have to die and be replaced. So that's why he's bald. The sculpture is a physical manifestation of a psychological phenomena, which I think is very interesting. This brings me to the why, which guides every decision I make. Whenever this sculpture confronted me, or any sculpture for that matter, confronted me with a question, whenever options were laid out in front of me, I consulted the why. Knowing the why is therefore essential because it helps you make a decision. If you know the why, everything can be viewed through a clear lens, and every fork in the road becomes easy to traverse. Knowing what you want the sculpture to say, what you want it to represent, is therefore essential, I think. Perhaps not essential, but it gives you an automatic roadmap. In this case, it fits well with the theme of the sculpture too, which is kind of funny, which is asking for and discovering your why and viewing all your decisions through the lens of your why, which should make any fork in the road in real life a lot easier to traverse as well. It's like having a compass. The same goes in a technical sense for sculpture, even if it's as simple as a motion, for example, and the sculpture is not representing or being a part of a story at all. For example, are you after a more harsh, brutal atmosphere? Then perhaps a soft, subtle forms are not the best decision. Perhaps more angular, harsher, aggressive modeling of forms is needed. Perhaps a relaxed pose with closed eyes does not work well to communicate a harsh and brutal mood. So every decision down to the body type of your model, the gender of your model, and the pose they take can be viewed through such a lens. I didn't choose this model by accident. It was very much on purpose. I knew what I was after. I knew what I wanted in this sculpture. And the model fit what I wanted. That does not mean that I don't allow things to organically evolve if I feel the need for them to do so. Ideas evolve and change as we spend time committing to creating them, and so I do allow for that to happen. Sometimes drastic changes are needed, but luckily that's rare. In this case, I've hardly bumped into any changes as far as the idea and communicating it goes. It was fairly set in stone from an early stage, which just means things were planned out well, right? The maquette is a big part of that planning stage, and a lot of questions I had were answered in the maquette, and some new compositional answers were discovered in there as well. That's it for this week's episode. Next week will be either Q&A week, so leave your questions below in the comments, or perhaps Dante's Inferno Maquette Part 2. Part 1 did really well, so I hope you'll be excited for either video. In real life, I am days away from finishing this sculpture, so if you would like to jump ahead of the YouTube videos and see where it's at and what it'll look like once it's finished, you can do so on my Instagram, which there is a link to below in the description as well. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. There are several rewards, one of them being the maquette for this very sculpture you've seen me working on today. So check it out, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Subscribe and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and share with your friends and family, it helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.